Okay, we're going to continue now speaking about the life of the early Capuchins. We were talking about the constitutions of Albacina, and we got partially through them. We have to finish up here on that, and then we'll speak about the early life and get back to the happenings of the early Capuchins and how they observed the life and all that went into the founding of the community. Again, like I said earlier, we're still early on. It's about 30 friars gathered together up on Albacina, a little mountaintop there, in a small chapel, as they're writing the constitutions. And so as we went through the constitutions of 1529, we mentioned how the Statutes of Albacina, the constitutions, were more of a correction or a fixing of the observant constitutions. So these constitutions were written so that they could correct and bring the observant constitutions back in line with the rule, to redirect them to the life of Francis and in the way that the early friars observed the rule. So again, it was bringing it back in line with the rule. Okay, so let's look at the formation. It mentions in here that there was to be a 15-day visit before you would begin novitiate. So you'd spend those 15 days with the community, 2 weeks, as a means of getting to know the life and really assessing and evaluating whether or not you can actually live the life. We could call that an early form of postulancy. They didn't have postulancy back then when one entered religious life. And so the Capuchins developed this 15 days of preparation or evaluation, kind of what our Lord says in the Gospels, that one should sit down and calculate whether or not one has enough to finish the tower before building the tower. So as you visit those 15 days, you to calculate whether or not you have the stamina to live that life as being proposed. Okay? So upon entrance to novitiate, one must distribute all things to the poor, following what St. Francis says in the Rule and the Testament. Okay? You have to be at least 15 years old. Now, canon law today says you can actually enter novitiate at 17. And it's going to depend from country to country, but canon law, universal law of the church, put the minimum age of 17. Here in 1529, the minimum age was 15. Okay? It says here the novices are to memorize the rule. So you had to memorize the rule. They ask yourselves, do I have the rule memorized? Can I quote it? And so this is something that the novices, even to this day, should be doing, is memorizing the rule that St. Francis wrote. It's not that hard. It's, 12 paragraphs, or maybe 15 paragraphs, 12 chapters, but they're small, so it shouldn't be too hard to do. Okay? It says that the newly professed are under a master of instruction for 4 years. So after the you make your novitiate, you finish, you make perpetual vows. Because remember, back then there wasn't temporary vows. Temporary vows was something that was introduced in the 1800s in a response to the persecution of the church, when in areas of the world you were not allowed to make perpetual vows. And so temporary vows was something that was introduced. It was not part of the original form of religious life. It's something that goes back only 100 years ago, where, perpetual vows after novitiate goes back all the way to the times of the apostles. That vowing oneself to God, giving oneself to God, putting your hands to the plow and not looking back. And so in the time of the Capuchin reform of 1529, what they decided to do in order to better form the friars, that after novitiate, you were basically put under an instructor for 4 years. And that instructor was to help you, to guide you, to assist you in living the life. Today we call this temporary formation programs, right? So after novitiate, you should be in a program of temporary profession where you're being continually formed as a religious, as a Franciscan, formed in the faith, formed in morals, formed in your human formation as a human, So anyway, so that was added on. Now, a little bit more on poverty here. These constitutions forbid razors, and only scissors can be kept to cut the tonsure every 20 days. So you get your hair cut every 20 days. And there was to be no procurator, no syndic, only our Lord and Our Lady and St. Francis. So none of this having this person working at the Vatican on your behalf to get what you needed from the Vatican. No syndic, no procurator. And really simplified the life that way of just trust in the Lord, let him provide, And then in keeping with the rule, it says no mule or horse, that the friars are to travel on sick except I'm sorry, travel on foot, except for the sick, where, as it says in the rule, then they can travel on horseback. So when it comes to the liturgy with poverty, there was no wearing of berettas. You know, the berettas are those black hats you see priests wear. It has the three fins and on the Trinity with a little pom-pom. The Capuchins were like, no, we don't need berettas. You have your hood, that's good enough. They did ban the eating of meat on Wednesdays. And another rule is that you couldn't lock your cell. Okay. Now, when they built the friaries, the Constitution states that only the general chapter could decide to open a friary. So friars just couldn't go and do it on their own. It was left to the chapter to decide. And this becomes a standard for Capuchins, is that the friary has to be built a mile outside the city. And now the constitutions of 1535, 1536 will clarify as to why. It's so that the people can go to the friars for spiritual help, and then close enough for the friars to go in for begging and so forth, the ministry. But they wanted the friary separate from the people. They wanted it in a more contemplative atmosphere, a mile outside the city, so that they could preserve their life of prayer, and yet at the same time be close enough for people to come to them and close enough for them to go to the people. Okay? So the property was always to belong to a city over a private person. So the friars were never to own the property. So I guess the diocese could own it, the city could own it, private people could own it, but they did not want to be the owners of that property. And they were to be built, the friaries were to be built as humble as possible, built from mud, clay, sticks, or rocks, small in stature. We would call that today drywall, right? Or stucco. Very simple construction, not using fancy large stones and so forth. Simple. They said the cells should be graves for the living, prisons for penitents. And so when you visit Capuchin friaries, the old ones, you'll see that. You stretch your arms out, that's as wide as the room was, and basically long enough to lay down and maybe a couple extra feet. I stayed in a Capuchin friary built in the 16th century, and it was about 6 feet wide and about 8 feet long. That was about the size of a room. Or 6 by 9, 6 by 8. Very simple cell, a small window this big with a little wooden door that opens up to the outside. Okay. And then each of the friaries were to have on the property, there should be a hermitage there on the property so that the friars could go and take some quiet solitude time. We'll see later on in the 1536 constitutions that these hermitages on the property were particularly used by the preachers. That when they came back from preaching, they should retire in solitude for a while to regain their spiritual strength, take a bit of a breather, and enter back into contemplation and prayer. And when they were in hermitage, no one was to speak to them except their superiors, and the brothers were to bring them food. It was very similar to what Francis had written in the rule for hermits. Now, they were only to accept houses that were poor, humble, and modest. Poor, humble, and modest were the three conditions given to a friary when they were given a friary, what they should look for, whether or not to accept it. Is it poor? Is it humble? Is it modest? It said no vain or precious pictures in cells. So personal cells were not to be all decorated with this and that, and pictures of this one, pictures of that one. It was a basic rule of only a cross and an image of Our Lady. Very simple. Nothing secular about it. And that was to allow the sacred images to speak more loudly. When there's lots of images, you can get lost in it. When it's just the crucifix and Our Lady, what happens, it allows you to draw the attention to the crucifix, draw the attention to Our Lady, draw the mind, the heart, and the soul to Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary, and remind you of why you're there and who it is you're there for. And so it allows the person to actually enter into more of an austere setting where it allows the images to speak more profoundly and loudly. Now, in regards to government, there was the Vicar General. Now, remember, the Vicar General, the Capuchins, was the one that they elected who would be underneath the Minister General of the conventuals, because they switched from being under the observants to being underneath the conventuals, and so they were answerable to the conventual general. Okay? And these generals and provincials had to be elected and then to fulfill their office properly, and if not, they were to be removed. And there was to be no politicking at chapter, similar to the rule that Pope John Paul II put in, regarding the conclave, that no politicking for the Pope and no politicking for yourself. And if you do, it invalidates the election, Now, the Capuchins didn't go that extreme, but they said there's no politicking that goes on, So some other various items. They would sleep on bare boards or a board covered with straw. And the sick could have a small, thin mattress with straw. So you see that the Capuchins slept on bare boards, that sense of the cross, that sense of understanding of penance, that they were not seeking comforts. You were allowed to have a pillow, though. Pillow made of straw. So you could have a pillow, but you had to sleep on a board. No women were allowed in the friary because they wanted to maintain the cloister, avoid scandal, and also to maintain and protect the brother's chastity. It's very important. No one is permitted to be buried in a friary churches except the friars and the poor who are refused by their pastors. And again, they were not allowed to receive money for funerals. So this was done to, again, bring peace between the diocesan priests and the friars. One of the reasons why the diocesan priests got mad at the friars back in the 13th century is because they were having the funerals at the friaries, the people being buried at the friaries, and then they were giving the money to the friaries. And so the Capuchins said, none of this. We don't want any kind of controversy. We're not doing that. Not our job. We're not the pastors. We're not parish priests. Let the parish priests do that in their parish, people in their parishes. Right? There was no eating between meals without permission. So that sense of austerity in food, that sense of penance, that if you needed to eat between meals, you would ask permission. And that asking of permission allows the person then to consider whether or not it's necessary or not, that what they're doing, taking this meal, is actually necessary or not. It says, if a friar needs to speak during silence, it should be in a subdued and humble voice. So again, the friaries had established areas and times for silence. This has been completely lost to religious, particularly Franciscan life today. That there were to be places and times of silence in the friary. Phones, TVs, internet has really taken this away and not allowed the friaries to really be places of prayer where the friars give themselves over to communication with God. And so it has brought the world into the cloister when the friars are trying to put in place a cloister that reverenced the beauty and the dignity of silence. And if they were to speak, they were to speak in a low and subdued voice as a way of truly maintaining that sense of prayer and contemplation. Okay, you couldn't transfer from one province to another without the permission of the provincials involved. They're writing this, but kind of hoping that they'll have provinces one day, because at this point they don't have provinces. They just have 30 friars, that's all. And they established that no more than 6 to 8 friars in each friary, at most 12. And the reason why they did that was so to maintain poverty. The 6 to 8 friars turned to being 8 and 12 later on. And the reason why they'll give those numbers is that to maintain poverty, but also to maintain the regular functioning of the friary. The brother cook, the brother doing the laundry, the brother gardener, the brother porter. They needed more than just the 6 to 8. They bump it to 8 to 12, but that minimum number in order to maintain the life and no more. Okay? And it's also a very apostolic number, 12. The vestments are to be simple, nothing too fancy. There were to be 2 chalices per friary. No silk or velvet vestments, so very nice. Nothing, again, going back to like the breviary, nothing feminine. As his old habits are to be kept in a closet, and a friar is assigned to clean and mend them. And the constitutions are to be read weekly with the rule. So they want the constitutions to be read when the rule was read, so that the friars could reflect upon how they were supposed to live the rule by looking at the constitutions. Part of the danger of religious life is forgetting how it is in the manner in which we should be living. And so it's necessary to keep fresh both the rule, the testament, and the constitutions if one's going to maintain the life well. And the Capuchins will do this. They'll remain very faithful until the 1800s in observing this precept of having it read often and knowing it well. And we'll see in 1535, 1536, the constitutions changed, but remained basically the same until 1917, when a lot of adaptations were made, and a lot of it was lost. Okay. Now, they were the early days of the Capuchins. And so bouncing off these constitutions, how did these friars live, you know? They now have these constitutions, they have these friaries that are out there, and how do they live? According to the Capuchin Chronicle, we have some things about the early Capuchins and how they live, which are good to know. They said the garments were the coarsest material. They had water, bread, vegetables, and fruit, and hardly ever ate fresh meat. Kind of gets that, that sounding of the Desert Fathers, you know. They observed fast rigorously, so they were very strong in their fasting. And they said some fasted almost continuously. Now remember, a fast is 2 small meals that don't equal 1 meal, and then 1 main meal, and no eating between meals. They said their dwellings were simple and poor, built of wood and loom, and they were 2 to 3 miles outside the city. Even though the Constitution said 1 mile, most of their friars at this time were 2 to 3 miles outside the city. As it stated the Constitutions, they slept on boards. They said the chapels were small, they were simple and clean, devoid of all precious adornments, and sacred vessels were simple and poor. So you get these images of these very, very austere chapels, you know. And again, this is the midst of the days of the Renaissance. And so the Capuchins are standing countercultural to the Renaissance by having simple, poor, austere chapels in keeping with the mind of St. Francis. They weren't doing this simply as a reaction to the culture. They were acting countercultural, but they were acting counterculture in the mind of Francis. So they were keeping faithful to St. Francis while they were being countercultural. I.e., St. Francis is always going to be countercultural. And when they say a small church, they don't mean a little small 10 by 10 little room, you know. It was in comparison to those big basilicas and churches. So you always have to look at things in their context. So when they say small churches, they mean like a church that can hold at most 100 people at most. You know, very small, tiny chapels, you know, that were built for enough for people to come and listen to the divine office and attend Mass, okay? It says here that the brothers greeted each other warmly. And that shouldn't be overlooked because one thing Francis did create was a fraternity, a brotherhood. You know, Francis never called the friars monks or so forth. He called them friars, brothers. And so that concept of family was incredibly important. So when it speaks about the early friars greeting each other warmly, it's speaking about the fraternity, which goes to the heart of the Franciscan charism, along with poverty and penance and prayer and minority. That fraternity is an essential aspect and is a witness to the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. What our Lord Jesus Christ, this is how they will know you are my disciples, by your love for one another. And so that charity, that love, that fraternal bond must exist within the fraternal life. It's not a bunch of guys who don't know each other, don't care about each other. No, they need to have a good fraternal bond of truly caring for one another. Okay? It says they only spoke of God and the congregation, and they spoke of low and humble voice. You kind of get the image of when the friar, they talked about in the early sources of St. Francis, when they were gathered living in the Portiuncula, that when they talked of God. They didn't talk about anything outside. They didn't talk about worldly things. They didn't talk about politics. They kept the conversation focused upon God and focused upon the life. Okay? And it mentions here, too, that the guardians attended to the sick. They attended to the sick, which is kind of nice because you get that sense that they were doing what St. Francis ordered in the rule, that one should care for the sick more than a mother cares for her son, according to the flesh. So much more should a friar minor tend to his brother according to the Spirit. So that sense of true love. Okay? So that gives us the end of the Constitutions of Albacina, and it gives us a little bit of a feel of the radicality, the austerity, the strength of these early first friars who were praying the divine office throughout the day. They had their breviaries with no singularity. They weren't introducing all other prayers except the rosary in common. They were spending 2 hours of prayer meditation. They were not building up big food supplies, but they were begging every day. They were truly living the Franciscan ideal, each house. And they were doing it with great radicality, with great strength, great vigor, and with great joy and charity. Okay? So let's look at this government of Ludovico Fossombrone. So Ludovico Fossombrone went to Rome, where Catherine of Cibo introduced him to many influential people. Ludovico was aware that if this institute were going to survive, it needed to be more than a local movement. Okay? He realized that the reform was going to be in danger, and reforms are always in danger because there's always those who want to crush it, whether it be other friars who want to crush it, whether it be bishops who want to crush it, whether it be diocesan priests who want to crush it. There is always a movement to crush reforms. Okay? Just the way it is, And the history of Franciscan life easily points that out. And sometimes it collapses from within. That's also true. There are all those within the community that unwittingly collapse it. Okay? So at a meeting with the Pope, Ludovico was made Commissioner Vicar General until they can hold on the General Chapter. Now remember, Matteo de Bascio surrendered. They elected him at the chapter. They elected him general, but he surrendered it after just a few days. And Ludovico, it passed to him because he was the Vicar General. And here the Pope approves him as being the general, Vicar General under the conventuals, but in charge of the reform until another chapter was held. So during this time, he made friends with Lorenzo Vanozzi, the governor of San Giacomo Hospital. And Ludovico was offered the church and rectory of Santa Maria dei Miracoli on the condition that the friars would serve at the hospital. And so we see the friars now getting a friary in Rome itself, and that the ministry would be to the hospital. So it became the first friary in Rome, and the friar service to the sick and the great austerity won the admiration of the people of Rome. And so we see how the early friars really dug in to that ministry to the poor, to the sick, So they're living in this friary of Maria de Miracoli, serving the hospital of San Giacomo. Okay? So then Ludovico received a visit from Fra Bernardino da Reggio. He was also known as Il Giorgio, kind of his nickname, Il Giorgio. Why they called him the George, I don't know, but that was his name, Il Giorgio. He was an observant from Calabria. Now, Il Giorgio was an educated friar from the University of Paris. He spoke Greek, and he debated in philosophy, so he was a pretty brilliant guy. 5 years prior to this meeting with Ludovico, he had met up with a group of observant friars who were seeking reform. And they began in Rome at Santi Apostoli, but it failed in 1526. Remember what I said about reform movements always being under pressure? Well, Il Giorgio's reform movement that lasted to 1526 failed. They returned to their own province and took the name Recollects and lived as hermits under the Observant Provincial. And so Il Giorgio and these friars who had found this reform in Rome moved back to their province and were living in hermitage friaries. And things were getting difficult in their province. Again, this little reform movement from in the province of the observants was being pressured to stop. So Il Giorgio came to Rome to seek out Ludovico to talk with him about what he was doing in his reform movement to see what they could do together. So after several meetings, the Recollects, as they were nicknamed, this little group from Calabria, they joined the Capuchins. So on August 16th, a formal document of admittance was drawn up. And on Il Giorgio's return from Rome, the Recollects adopted the Capuchin habit. I mean, that unity wasn't confirmed until 30 years later, but this became really the first province of Capuchins was in Calabria, where Il Giorgio, who was heading up this little reform on the observance, formed a unity with Ludovico Fossombrone, adopted the Capuchin constitutions, adopted the Capuchin habit, and formed a unity with them. And so they began to form in this unity with one constitution and one habit. And so it's a little bit different than the observant reform, where you saw Bernardino of Siena trying to gather all these different reform movements into one, trying to write a constitution for everybody, trying to please everybody. We hear you have Ludovico and Il Giorgio forming this unity through the use of the constitutions, the use of the habit, use of the form of life. So a large number of observant friars began to transfer to the Capuchin reform. So and a lot of people moving over because they saw that, okay, this reform seems to be it. And there was still that thirst, that hunger among so many of the observants, because it wasn't long before that they had split from the conventuals and maintained and obtained their own status as a separate community. But in the meantime, they lost their observance. So now they're like, okay, we got a reform movement that's actually observing. Let's go there, But the Minister General was not happy with that, obviously. So the Minister General Paolo Pisotti, P-I-S-O-T-T-I, Pisotti. Paolo Pisotti. He was a sinister man of whom history has nothing good to say. Observant history records his administration as disastrous. So he was not exactly the best Minister General to be having a reform movement under or with. He had no use for reform movements and no use for hermits. Upon election, he began to persecute the reformers. And so the Cardinal Protector of the Order had to stop him. And Minister General Pisotti sent a letter to all the provincials telling them to stop persecuting the friars. Then he sent another private letter telling them to keep up the persecution. So this guy was a bit of a player, He kind of knew how to play the politics. Oh, okay, Cardinal of Ostia, the Protector of the Order, I won't persecute the friars anymore. Oh, no. Everybody, please stop persecuting the friars. Hey, guys, keep persecuting the friars, okay? Shh, don't tell the Cardinal Protector. Kind of that was what he was doing, So, in 1533, Pope Clement VII demanded Pisotti's resignation. That's how bad it got. His general was so bad. So in 1529, go back up through 4 years, Pisotti's general, it made the Capuchins look like the saviors of the order. So you have this horrible, disastrous general, who was persecuting reformers and some of those trying to live the rules. So it made the Capuchins look like, God's gift to the world. And they were. Okay? And so the saviors of the order. So Ludovico would have to contend with Pisotti for a few years. And Pisotti had a great hatred for the Capuchins. Okay? So we're going to get back to Pisotti on our next class, and we'll talk about him and his generalate and continuing the drama of reform. So now we're kind of set up to see how the early Capuchins are really living now. The rule of Francis, they got this austerity, they got this uniformity of life, they're growing in numbers, they're building up. You got the province of the Marches of Ancona, you got the province in Calabria, you have a general persecuting them, and you have the ranks swelling. And you have the Pope who's going to get involved, and it's going to be rather a bit of drama that happens from here on. But it's a fun time to see where the Capuchin reform is breaking out and starting to build and grow. But maintaining uniformity of life and maintaining a hierarchy of principles that allows them to maintain the life. The hierarchy of prayer, penance, poverty, minority, community, and finally, the apostolate. And they will maintain that priority up into the mid-1800s, which will sustain them in observing the rule of St. Francis, observing the primitive life, observing the rule without mitigation for 3 centuries. So we'll pick up on some more of the history at our next class. All right, may Almighty God bless you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.